In the heart of Cedar Grove, where time moves as slow as molasses and rust claims even the proudest machines, stands Frank's classic auto restoration. For 40 years, Frank Reeves has brought dead engines back to life, his weathered hands breathing, soul into metal that others deemed beyond salvation. His reputation has drawn collectors from across the country, but none quite like the pristine Mercedes that just pulled into his lot. Behind its wheel sits Eleanor Mitchell, whose elegant appearance masks a net worth of billions and a heart that spent decades searching for the mechanic who once promised her forever over the hood of a '67 Mustang. She's finally found him, but Frank doesn't recognize the girl he loved in the woman before him. Dawn breaks over Cedar Grove with the reliability of a well-tuned engine. Frank Reeves moves through his workshop with practiced ease, his morning routine as familiar as the worn pages of the 1967 Mustang workshop manual that's never far from reach. The manual, dog-eared and oil-stained, rests in its usual spot on the workbench, its spine cracked from decades of consultation. "Morning, Mr. Reeves." Tommy Chen bursts through the side door, bringing with him the energy of youth and the smell of fresh coffee. At 23, he's everything Frank remembers being at that age, eager, quick to learn, and completely captivated by the magic of American muscle cars. "You're early, kid," Frank observes, accepting the coffee cup Tommy extends. They both know it's not a criticism. In 3 years as Frank's apprentice, Tommy has never been late once. "Got a feeling about today?" Tommy grins, already pulling on his work coveralls. "Something in the air." Frank allows himself a small smile. The boy's enthusiasm is infectious, even after all these years. He watches as Tommy begins their opening. Ritual. Checking the previous day's work, testing connections, ensuring tools are in their proper places. The workshop itself is a testament to Frank's philosophy. Everything has its place. Every tool tells its story. Vintage signs and photographs line the walls, each one carefully preserved. Among them, partially hidden behind a calendar, hangs a photograph Frank hasn't looked at properly in years. 2 young people, their whole lives ahead of them, smiling, over the hood of a car. "Mr. Reeves," Tommy's voice breaks through his reverie, "the Henderson Corvette is ready for final inspection." Frank nods, pushing away memories that seem determined to surface today. He moves to the cherry-red Corvette, his expert eyes scanning for imperfections. His hands, weathered but steady, glide over the pristine paint job. "Beautiful work, Tommy," he acknowledges. "Your color matching is getting better." The pride in Tommy's face makes Frank think of another young mechanic decades ago, receiving similar praise from his own father. The memory brings both warmth and an old, familiar ache. Their morning continues with the comfortable rhythm of a shop that's seen thousands of such days. The phone rings with its usual inquiries, parts availability, restoration timelines, cost estimates. Frank handles each call with the patience of someone who understands that every project is someone's dream being restored. "Latest issue of Classic Car Weekly came in," Tommy announces, flipping through the magazine during their brief lunch break. "They're featuring that Packard restoration you did last summer." Frank glances at the article, noting the photographs that don't quite capture the hundreds of hours of work that went into bringing that particular car back to life. His eyes drift to the manual again, its familiar presence a constant reminder of where his journey began. "You never did tell me why you keep that specific manual so close," Tommy ventures, following his gaze. "Must be special." Frank runs a hand over the manual's worn cover, feeling the years beneath his fingers. "Sometimes, kid, the most important restorations aren't just about the cars." Before Tommy can probe further, the distinct sound of an expensive European engine purrs into the parking lot. Through the workshop windows, they see a Mercedes that looks more at home in Beverly Hills than Cedar Grove. "Now, that's not our usual clientele," Tommy whispers, straightening his coveralls. Frank rises slowly, something tugging at the edges of his memory. There's something about the way the car comes to a stop, precise and deliberate, that feels familiar in a way he can't quite place. "Better go see what they need," he says, more to himself than Tommy. As he moves toward the door, the workshop manual catches the morning light, its pages holding more than just mechanical specifications. They hold the beginning of a story, about to come full circle. The bell above the door chimes as Frank steps into the morning sun, unaware that his carefully ordered world is about to shift on its axis. Behind him, Tommy watches with curious eyes, not yet understanding that he's about to witness more than just another restoration project. Eleanor Mitchell's hands remain steady on the Mercedes steering wheel, betraying none of the emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. She's rehearsed this moment countless times during the long drive from Boston, but now that she's here, the practiced words feel inadequate. She reaches for the glove compartment, retrieving a photograph she's carried for 40 years. The image is worn at the corners, softened by time and handling. A young couple at a drive-in movie theater, their faces lit by moonlight and possibility. She studies her younger self, barely 18 and fearlessly in love, standing beside a boy whose smile could outshine any chrome finish. "Just another client," she reminds herself, tucking the photograph away. The words ring hollow even as she speaks them. Frank emerges from the workshop, and Eleanor's breath catches. He's older. Now, of course, they both are. But his stance is unchanged, that characteristic tilt of his head as he assesses a vehicle. She forces herself to step out of the car, her heels crunching on the gravel. "Welcome to Frank's Classic Auto Restoration," he says, his voice carrying the same warm roughness she remembers. "What can we help you with today?" Eleanor meets his eyes, searching for any flicker of recognition. There is none. Part of her aches at this, while another part is relieved. This way she can control the revelation, just as she's controlled everything else in her life since leaving Cedar Grove. "I have a project car," she says carefully, "one that requires special attention." Tommy appears in the doorway, watching. With undisguised curiosity, Eleanor notes how Frank's posture shifts slightly, protective, mentoring, and she remembers when his father used to stand the same way with him. "What kind of car are we talking about?" Frank asks, professional. Interest overtaking any hint of wariness about her obvious wealth. "A 1967 Mustang," Eleanor replies, watching his face. "It's being delivered later today. I was hoping to discuss the restoration parameters first." Something flickers in Frank's expression. So brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking for it. His hands move unconsciously to his pockets, a gesture so familiar it makes her throat tight. "Come into the office," he offers. "We can talk details there." The office is exactly as Eleanor imagined it would be, meticulously organized, with the smell of leather and motor oil mingling in the air. Her eyes scan the walls, noting the careful arrangement of certificates and photographs. She spots several, of Frank with his father, and one. Her heart jumps. There, partially hidden behind a calendar, is another copy of the photograph she carries. Frank hasn't removed it all these years. "The Mustang," Frank says, settling behind his desk. "What's its current condition?" Eleanor forces her attention back to the present. "It's been in storage for decades. The engine needs complete restoration, bodywork, interior, basically everything." Frank finishes, already making notes. His practical approach steadies her. "Yes," she agrees. "Everything." Tommy hovers in the doorway, clearly intrigued by this unusual client. Eleanor watches as Frank gestures him in, including him in the consultation. The young man's enthusiasm reminds her painfully of Frank at that age. "Original parts wherever possible," she adds. "Cost is no object." Frank's pencil pauses. He looks up, really studying her for the first time. That's an expensive commitment. For a car that might not be worth it. "Some things are worth more than money, Mr. Reeves." The use of his surname feels strange on her tongue, but she maintains the pretense. Frank's expression suggests he's caught something in her tone, but he returns to his notes without comment. They discuss timeline, expectations, documentation. Eleanor provides the car's history, most of it anyway, while Tommy takes detailed notes. Throughout the conversation, she's acutely aware of the photograph on the wall, of the matching one in her glove compartment, of all the years between then and now. As she rises to leave, Eleanor allows herself one more glance at the partially hidden photograph. "You've built quite a reputation, Mr. Reeves. I'm confident my car will be in good hands. We'll take good care of her," Frank promises, and for a moment Eleanor isn't sure if he's talking about the car or something else entirely. Walking back to her Mercedes, Eleanor feels Tommy's curious gaze following her. She wonders if he's noticed how his mentor's eyes kept drifting to the calendar on the wall, or how his hands trembled slightly when she mentioned the Mustang's year of manufacture. Some restorations, she thinks, require more than just mechanical expertise. Some require the courage to open old doors, to face what waits behind them. As she starts her car, Eleanor touches the photograph in her glove compartment one more time, a talisman of what was and what might be again. Back in her hotel room, Eleanor opens her worn leather attaché case and removes a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages are thick with pressed flowers, old ticket stubs, and the passionate writings of her 18-year-old self. She handles it carefully, as if the memories might spill out if she moves too quickly. June 15th, 1967, the first entry reads, "Her handwriting was different then, looser, more optimistic. The world shifts, colors fading into the sepia tones of memory. Summer heat ripples off the pavement as Eleanor Mitchell pulls her father's Chrysler into Ray's service station. The car isn't really having problems. She's made sure of that. But she's heard about old Ray's son, the one with the magic touch for engines. "Can I help you?" The voice belongs to a young man wiping his hands on a red shop rag. Frank Reeves, she knows, without asking. He's exactly as Katie from school described. Tall, with kind eyes, and a smile that suggests he knows secrets about every engine ever built. "The steering wheel vibrates sometimes," Eleanor lies, hoping she sounds convincing, "especially when I turn left." Frank's eyes narrow slightly, not suspicious but focused. "Mind if I take a look?" She watches as he slides behind the wheel, his movements confident but careful. The respect he shows for the car, even her father's staid Chrysler, tells her everything she needs to know about him. "Turn left," you said. He's already got the hood up, those capable hands moving with purpose. Eleanor moves closer, inhaling the mixed scents of oil, metal, and summer air. "My father says I should just learn to live with it, but—" "Your father's wrong." Frank glances up, then quickly adds, "About the car, I mean. You should never just live with a problem, not when it can be fixed." Something in his tone makes her heart skip. "Is that what you do? Fix things?" "I try." He straightens up, wiping his hands again. "But I don't think your steering needs fixing. The alignment's perfect." Caught in her pretense, Eleanor feels heat rise to her cheeks. "Oh?" Instead of calling her out, Frank's smile turns conspiratorial. "But since you're here, want to see something special?" He leads her to the back of the garage where, under a canvas cover, sits the most beautiful car Eleanor has ever seen. Frank pulls back the cover with the flourish of a magician revealing his best trick. 1967. "Mustang," he says, pride evident in his voice. "Bought her cheap because everyone said she was too far gone. Been rebuilding her in my spare time." Eleanor circles the car slowly. It's only partially restored, with primer showing in patches and missing trim pieces, but she can see the potential. More importantly, she can see how Frank looks at it, like it's not just a car, but a promise. "She's going to be gorgeous," Eleanor says, meaning it. "You know cars." There's no condescension in his question, only genuine interest. "I know beauty when I see it." She meets his eyes. "And potential." The moment stretches between them, filled with the hum of cicadas and distant traffic. Frank clears his throat. "I could show you more if you want. The restoration process, I mean. Not many people appreciate it." "I'd like that." Eleanor's heart is racing now. "I'd like that very much. Tomorrow." His eagerness matches her own. After closing, she should say no. Her father would be furious. The Mitchells don't associate with mechanics. But looking at Frank, at the passion and pride in his eyes, Eleanor knows she's already decided. Tomorrow, she agrees. That night she starts the journal, pressing a flower from her mother's garden between its pages. On the first page she writes, "Today I met someone who understands that broken things don't have to stay broken." The memory fades, leaving Eleanor in her hotel room, holding the journal with trembling hands. She turns to a page near the back, where a drive-in movie ticket stub is carefully preserved, their last night together before everything changed. She closes the journal gently. Tomorrow the Mustang will arrive, the same car, though Frank doesn't know it yet. She spent years tracking it down, buying it back at an auction in Arizona where it sat neglected in the desert heat. The timing had never been right before. Her business empire needed building, her children needed raising, her grief needed processing. But now, as she approaches 70, Eleanor finally understands what Frank knew all those years ago. You should never just live with a problem, not when it can be fixed. She returns the journal to her attaché case, but not before removing the pressed flower from that first entry. The dried petals are fragile now, like the memories they represent, but they've retained their shape. Some things, she reflects, are preserved not by force, but by patience. Outside her window, Cedar Grove's evening traffic hums softly. Somewhere out there, Frank is probably closing up his shop, still not knowing that tomorrow will bring more than just another restoration project. Eleanor touches the flower one last time before carefully returning it to its paper sanctuary. Some restorations take longer than others. The flatbed truck arrives just before noon, desert dust still clinging to its cargo. Frank stands in the morning light, watching as they lower the Mustang onto his lot. Even from a distance, something about the car tugs at his memory. The specific angle of the hood, the slightly customized front grille that nobody but a dedicated enthusiast would notice. "Holy cow," Tommy whispers beside him. "That's not just any '67 Mustang. Look at those custom appointments. Those weren't standard issue." Frank doesn't respond immediately. He's walking toward the car as if in a trance, his hand outstretched to touch the sun-faded paint. The desert has been both cruel and kind to her. The dry heat preserved the body better than humid climates would have, but the paint has suffered. Eleanor emerges from her Mercedes, watching Frank's approach. She's dressed more casually today, slacks and a blouse that wouldn't look out of place in any small town, but her presence still commands attention. "What do you think?" she asks, her voice carefully neutral. Frank runs his hand along the hood, feeling the familiar curves beneath decades of wear. "She's been through a lot," he says finally. "Arizona, you said?" "Yes, found her at an auction outside Phoenix." Something about the way she says "found her" catches his attention, but he's already moving to the driver's side door. It opens with a protesting creak, and the smell that wafts out nearly brings him to his knees. Old leather, desert heat, and something else. Something that whispers of drive-in movies and summer nights. "Mr. Reeves," Tommy's concerned voice breaks through his reverie. "You okay?" "Fine," Frank manages, forcing himself to focus on the technical assessment. "Tommy, get the diagnostic kit. We'll need to check every system." As Tommy hurries off, Frank slides into the driver's seat. His hands find the steering wheel, and, for a moment, he's struck by how perfectly they fit, as if the wheel remembers him. He shakes off the sensation, reaching for the glove compartment to check for registration documents. It's empty except for dust and a few old maps of Arizona highways. Of course it is. What was he expecting? "The engine's original," Eleanor offers from where she stands. "Everything is, actually. That's why I brought her to you. Your reputation for authentic restorations." "This will take time," Frank interrupts more gruffly than he intends, "and it won't be cheap." "I understand." Tommy returns with the diagnostic equipment, and they begin a methodical examination. Frank forces himself to approach it like any other project, checking compression, examining rust patterns, documenting every dent and missing piece. But his hands keep finding details that spark recognition. The slightly off-center hood latch that he remembers adjusting, the unique wear pattern on the door handle. "Look at this," Tommy calls from the trunk. "Custom reinforcement on the frame. Somebody really knew what they were doing." Frank's heart pounds. He had added those reinforcements himself, working late nights in his father's garage. But that car was long gone, sold when he was drafted, supposedly scrapped years ago. This couldn't be the same one, could it? "The interior will need complete restoration," he says, more to ground himself than anything else. "Custom work like this requires special attention to detail." "I trust your judgment," Eleanor replies, and something in her tone makes him look up sharply. She's watching him with an intensity that seems out of place for a simple car restoration. Frank turns back to the Mustang, focusing on the familiar routine of documentation. But each measurement, each notation in his worksheet feels like reading a letter from his younger self. The slight modification to the suspension that he'd been so proud of, the extra bracing behind the dashboard that nobody but the original builder would know to look for. "Tommy," he says finally, "give us a minute." Once the young man steps away, Frank turns to Eleanor. "Where did you really find this car?" She meets his gaze steadily. "Exactly where I said, an auction in Phoenix." "And before that? Does it matter?" Frank looks back at the Mustang, at 4 decades of history baked into its metal and rust. "Maybe not," he says finally, but they both hear the question in his voice. "I'll leave you to your assessment," Eleanor says softly. "You have my number. If you need anything." Frank watches her walk to her Mercedes, her elegant figure a sharp contrast to the worn Mustang. As she drives away, he returns to his examination, but his hands are shaking slightly as they move over the familiar curves of the car that, increasingly, he suspects he knows better than anyone else in the world. The Cedar Grove Gazette sits unopened on Martha's diner's counter, but its headline has already circulated through morning coffee conversations. "Mystery investor eyes downtown development." Below the fold, a smaller article catches attention. "Local auto shop draws wealthy client." Frank ignores both as he slides onto his usual stool, but Martha herself pushes the paper toward him with a knowing look. "Your shop's famous now," she says, already pouring his coffee, "though they didn't get her name. The mystery woman with the Mercedes." "Client confidentiality, Martha." Frank takes a sip of coffee, perfect as always. Martha leans on the counter. "Funny thing is, Sarah at the Grand Hotel says she requested the exact same room that overlooks your shop. Register shows E. Mitchell. Now, why would a wealthy woman want to watch an auto shop all day?" Frank's coffee cup pauses halfway to his lips. The name strikes him like a physical blow, but he keeps his expression neutral. Probably wants to keep an eye on her investment. "Investment, right." Martha's tone suggests she's not buying it. "Just like she probably picked your shop at random, despite there being 3 closer restoration specialists in Springfield." Before Frank can respond, the bell above the door chimes. Tommy enters, waving the same newspaper. "Mr. Reeves, have you seen this? They're saying she might be some tech billionaire in disguise." "Tabloid nonsense," Frank mutters, but his mind is racing. "Mitchell, could it really be?" "Well, disguise or not," Martha continues, "she's caused quite a stir. Chamber of Commerce is all aflutter about potential investment in the historic district. And did you hear about her lunch at Antonio's yesterday?" Frank hadn't, but he finds himself listening despite himself. "Ordered the simplest thing on the menu, but left a $1,000 tip. Antonio said she asked about the old drive-in theater site." The drive-in. Frank's hands tighten around his coffee cup. Too many coincidences. "That's not all," Tommy adds, sliding onto the next stool. "I did some digging online last night. There's an Eleanor Mitchell who's CEO of Mitchell Global Technologies. Started the company 30 years ago, built it from nothing. Very private person, hardly any photos available. "Tommy," Frank warns, but the young man is too excited to stop. And get this, she grew up somewhere in the Midwest, but all the details are pretty vague. The only clear thing is that she left for college in '67 and... Enough! Frank's voice is sharp enough to make both Tommy and Martha jump. "We don't gossip about clients." The diner falls silent except for the soft clinking of coffee cups and the distant sizzle of the grill. Frank stares into his coffee, seeing not his reflection, but the face of a young woman who'd once shared his dreams over late-night burgers in this very diner. Martha moves away to tend to other customers, but not before giving Frank a long, thoughtful look. She's known him for 30 years, served him breakfast every morning since he took over his father's shop. She remembers another Eleanor Mitchell, the banker's daughter who scandalized Cedar Grove by falling in love with a mechanic's son. Tommy fidgets with his napkin. "Sorry, Mr. Reeves. I just got excited about the publicity for the shop." Frank's expression softens. "No harm done, kid. But remember, our job is fixing cars, not solving mysteries." "Yes, sir." Tommy pauses. "Though, that Mustang she brought in, some of those custom modifications look an awful lot like the ones in those old photos in your office." Frank stands, leaving his coffee half-finished. "Time to open up." As they walk to the shop, Frank is acutely aware of the Grand Hotel looming over Main Street. He doesn't look up at the windows, doesn't let himself wonder if she's watching. Instead, he focuses on the day ahead. Parts to order, estimates to complete, a lifetime of routine to hide behind. But Cedar Grove is a small town, and some whispers refuse to be silenced. By closing time, 3 more people have casually dropped by the shop, each with their own theory about the mysterious Eleanor Mitchell. Frank answers their questions with mechanical politeness, while his mind churns with possibilities he's not ready to face. The Mustang sits stripped down in Frank's workshop, decades of wear laid bare under the unforgiving shop lights. Frank stands before it, holding a small manila envelope Eleanor had dropped off that morning. Inside is a paint chip, perfectly preserved. Candy apple red, original Ford code for 1967. "That's going to be something special," Tommy says, wheeling over the diagnostic equipment. "Not many people keep original paint samples for 40 years. Frank turns the chip over in his hands. He doesn't tell Tommy that he knows exactly why this particular shade was preserved, how he and Eleanor had spent an entire afternoon at the Ford dealership, comparing different reds until this one made her eyes light up. "Let's start with the engine teardown," he says instead, tucking the paint chip carefully into his shirt pocket. "Full documentation of every component." They work methodically, Frank guiding Tommy through the proper procedure for dismantling an engine that's been sitting idle for decades. Each part tells its story, the slight wear patterns on the cylinders, the custom modifications that feel like reading his own signature. "Mr. Reeves," Tommy calls from inside the engine bay. "Look at this." Frank moves closer, and his breath catches. There, stamped into a hidden corner of the engine block, are his initials, FR, along with a tiny heart he'd added on a whim, thinking nobody would ever see it. He remembers Eleanor laughing when he showed her, calling him a romantic, despite his protests. "Custom maker's mark?" Tommy asks. "Something like that." Frank turns away, busying himself with the parts catalogue. "We'll need to source period-correct replacements for the valves and rings." The morning progresses with the familiar rhythm of restoration work, but every component they remove feels weighted with memory. The shifter knob that Eleanor had helped him install, the custom pedal setup he'd adjusted to fit her smaller feet, the reinforced steering column that had been his pride and joy. Eleanor arrives just before lunch, dressed casually, but still managing to look elegantly out of place in the working garage. She carries a folder of documentation, build sheets, original specs, maintenance records that trace the car's journey. From Cedar Grove to Arizona. "How's it going?" she asks, her eyes taking in the partially dismantled car. "We're getting there," Frank responds, painfully aware of the paint chip in his pocket. "The engine's showing exactly what we expected. Complete rebuild needed. And the custom work? Her question is casual, but her gaze is intent. Will that be preserved? Frank meets her eyes briefly before looking back at the car. If that's what you want, though some might say it diminishes the value. Some things are worth more than market value, Mr. Reeves. Tommy glances between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent, but unsure of its meaning. Frank sends him to lunch early, waiting until the younger man is gone before speaking again. Why this car, Eleanor? It's the first time he's used her first name since she arrived, and they both feel the shift it represents. She moves closer to the Mustang, running her hand along its stripped-down frame. Because some restorations are about more than just metal. And paint, she says softly. You taught me that. Frank pulls the paint chip from his pocket. Candy apple red. You remember. I remember everything. His voice is rough. The dealership in Springfield, the way you insisted on this exact shade, how you said it had to be perfect because it was our future, she finishes. Our dream. They stand in silence, the ghost of their younger selves hovering between them like desert heat waves over Arizona highways. Finally, Frank speaks. There are easier ways to reconnect than hunting down an old car. Eleanor smiles, but it doesn't quite reach her eyes. Are there? I built a technology empire, Frank. Solving complex problems is what I do. But this, she gestures at the Mustang, this is the only solution that felt right. Before Frank can respond, Tommy returns from lunch. The moment breaks and Eleanor steps back, professional distance sliding back into place. I'll leave you to your work, she says. Just promise me something? Frank waits, paint chip still warm in his hand. Don't rush it. Some things are worth taking time to get right. She leaves them to their work, the click of her heels fading into the ambient sounds of the shop. Frank stares at the paint chip for a long moment before carefully placing it in the custom restoration folder he's created for the project. Everything okay? Tommy asks, sensing his mentor's distraction. Frank nods, turning back to the engine with renewed focus. Let's get back to work. This one needs to be perfect. The trunk's hidden compartment wasn't on any factory diagram. Tommy discovers it while removing the carpet liner, his fingers finding the catch that Frank had installed more than 40 years ago. The metal groans as it opens, releasing the scent of aged paper and forgotten summers. Mr. Reeves, Tommy calls out, you might want to see this. Frank approaches slowly, already knowing what they'll find. He'd built that compartment himself, lined it with cedar to protect its contents from moisture. Inside lies a bundle of letters, carefully tied with a faded blue ribbon that Eleanor had once worn in her hair. These were in the car all this time. Tommy asks, reaching for them. Don't! Frank's voice is hoarse. They're personal. But even as he says it, one letter slips free. Its yellowed envelope bearing elegant handwriting. To Frank, before you ship out. The postmark reads June 1968. Tommy respectfully steps back as Frank picks up the bundle with trembling hands. The ribbon comes loose, and decades-old correspondence spills out like autumn leaves, letters, postcards, snippets of dreams put to paper when they thought they had forever. I'll take my lunch break early, Tommy says quietly, already backing away. Give you some time. Frank barely notices him leave. He's already opening the first letter, his eyes finding words he once knew by heart. Dearest Frank, the garage feels empty without you here. Dad keeps saying I should be practical, think about my future. What he doesn't understand is that you are my future. Every car that comes in, I hear your voice explaining how to fix it. Remember how you taught me about timing belts? Everything has its moment, you said. You just have to be patient enough to find it. Well, I'm being patient. Vietnam can't last forever. And when you come home, we'll build that shop of our own. I've been studying the business papers you left me. By the time you return, I'll know everything about running our dream. All my love, Eleanor. Frank sinks onto his work stool, letters scattered across his lap. Each envelope contains a piece of their story. Eleanor's acceptance to business school, his increasingly sparse replies from Vietnam, her determination to wait, his growing certainty that he was holding her back. The last letter in the bundle is unopened, still sealed after all these years. The return address is the college where Eleanor had just started her business degree. Frank had never read it. By then, he'd already made his decision. Already. Told her to move on with her life. A soft sound makes him look up. Eleanor stands in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. She's holding another bundle of letters. "I kept all of yours," she says softly. "Even the last one, where you said goodbye. Eleanor, you thought you were doing the right thing." She moves closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "Letting me go, forcing me to focus on my education instead of waiting for a soldier who might never come home. You deserve better than half a life waiting for letters. That wasn't your choice to make." There's no anger in her voice, just old pain finally finding its voice. "I would have waited. I did wait, in my own way." She sets her bundle of letters next to his. Together they tell a complete story, or almost complete. Frank looks down at the unopened letter in his hands. "I never read this one." "I know." Eleanor's fingers brush his as she takes the envelope. "Would you like to know what it said?" Frank nods, unable to speak. "Dear Frank," she recites from memory, "I understand what you're trying to do. I don't accept it, but I understand. You think you're protecting me, giving me freedom. But real freedom isn't about being alone. It's about choosing who to build your life with. I choose you. I'll always choose you." She pauses, blinking back tears. "So I'm going to do what you asked. I'm going to build a life, make something of myself. But I'm not doing it because you pushed me away. I'm doing it because someday I want to come back to you as an equal. And when I do, I hope you'll still remember how to fix broken things." The workshop is silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft settling of old paper. Frank stares at the letters scattered between them, twin records of a love, interrupted but never quite ended. "You kept the car all this time," he says finally. "No," Eleanor shakes her head. "But I never stopped looking for it. Some things are worth waiting for." Eleanor reaches into her purse and withdraws a small velvet box, worn smooth by decades of handling. "There's one more thing I kept," she says, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. "You sold your toolbox to buy this." Frank stares at the ring he'd given her the night before his deployment. He'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined its perfect fit on her finger, the way it caught the light under the drive-in movie screen. "I couldn't sell it," Eleanor continues, "even after everything. It reminded me that dreams don't have to die. They just sometimes need time to find their way home." Tommy's footsteps approach the workshop door, then quickly retreat. Through the windows, they can see him redirecting a customer, protecting this moment of truth. "I told myself I was protecting you," Frank says finally. "Vietnam was changing me. The things I saw, what I had to do, I couldn't bear the thought of bringing that darkness back to you. So you pushed me away." Eleanor's voice is gentle. "Wrote that letter telling me to forget you, to build a life without you. And I did, Frank. I built an empire. But do you know what I discovered?" She places the ring box on the workbench beside the scattered letters. "Success feels hollow when you can't share it with the right person." Frank picks up one of his old letters, his younger self's handwriting bold and confident. "I used to know exactly who I was, what I wanted. Then the war." He pauses, gathering thoughts he's never shared. "I came back different. Took over Dad's shop because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Engines I could fix. Engines don't carry emotional baggage. But cars do," Eleanor says softly. "Every car tells a story. Isn't that what you always taught me?" A half smile touches Frank's lips. "Using my own words against me? Someone once told me that broken things don't have to stay broken." The morning sun streams through the workshop windows, catching the ring's diamond and sending prisms dancing across the weathered letters. Frank picks up the ring box, studying the symbol of promises made and broken. "Why now, Eleanor? After all these years?" "Because I finally understood something. She moves closer, her perfume mingling with the shop's familiar sense of oil and metal. We were so young then, both trying to protect each other in our own ways. You, by pushing me toward a bigger life. Me, by promising to wait forever. But maybe we needed these years apart to become the people who could truly appreciate what we had. And what was that? A love that understood potential, that saw beauty in broken things and had the patience to restore them properly. Frank looks at the partially dismantled Mustang, seeing not just the car, but the metaphor it represents. It won't be the same, you know. We can restore the car to its original condition, but us, I don't want us to be what we were, Eleanor interrupts. We're not those kids anymore. I'm not looking to restore our past, Frank. I'm hoping we can build something new, something better, with all the wisdom we've earned. A comfortable silence falls between them, filled with the weight of possibility. Through the windows, they can see Tommy chatting with Martha from the diner, who's arrived with their usual lunch order. The sight of their small-town routine continuing amidst this personal revelation feels oddly grounding. "You really tracked down our old car?" Frank asks, a hint of admiration in his voice. "I have resources now," Eleanor smiles. "And very good. Investigators. When it turned up at that auction in Arizona, it felt like fate, though I suspect fate had some help from that custom engine block stamping." Frank chuckles, the sound rusty but genuine. "I never thought anyone would see that." "You always did like signing your work." She picks up one of the letters. "Just like you signed every letter with that little sketch of a wrench. You remembered that?" "I remembered everything too, Frank." The ring catches the light again, and Frank realizes he's still holding the box. With deliberate care, he sets it on the workbench between them. "So what now?" Eleanor glances at the Mustang. "Well, I believe I hired you to restore a car. Maybe while you're doing that, we can work on restoring something else. Take it slow, do it right, like a proper restoration." "Exactly," she smiles. "No rushing, no cutting corners. Just two people who understand that some things are worth the time it takes to fix them properly." From outside comes the sound of Tommy dropping something, followed by Martha's laugh. The normal sounds of Cedar Grove continuing its day, unaware that inside this workshop time is being rewritten. "I'd like that," Frank says finally, "a proper restoration." Eleanor's smile deepens. "Then let's get to work." By noon, the news has spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. Martha's diner buzzes with conversation, the morning cinnamon rolls forgotten as patrons trade stories about Frank and Eleanor's past. Behind the counter, Martha smiles knowingly as she refills coffee cups, occasionally correcting details. After all, she'd served them countless late-night burgers during that summer of '67. At his workbench, Frank sorts through a small collection of drive-in movie ticket stubs he'd found in his office drawer. Each one marks a Friday night from that summer. Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, Cool Hand Luke. He'd kept them all, though he'd never admitted it to anyone. The shop's phone rings constantly, but Tommy handles each call with diplomatic skill beyond his years. Mr. Reeves is currently focused on a special restoration project. "May I take a message?" Eleanor's morning meeting with the Chamber of Commerce has turned into an impromptu press conference. Local reporters cluster outside. The municipal building, drawn by the story of the secret billionaire with small-town roots. "Ms. Mitchell, is it true you're investing in Cedar Grove's historic district? Will Mitchell Global Technologies be opening offices here? Are the rumors about you and Frank Reeves true?" Eleanor handles their questions with practiced grace, neither confirming nor denying the personal speculation. "I'm here because Cedar Grove has something special, craftsmen who understand that quality takes time and attention. The rest," she smiles, "is a private matter." Back at the shop, Frank finds another ticket stub tucked into his old toolbox. Wait Until Dark, their last movie together before he shipped out. He remembers Eleanor's hand in his, the way she jumped at the scary parts and pretended she hadn't. "Local girl makes good, returns for love," reads the headline on the Cedar Grove Gazette's website. Tommy shows it to Frank on his phone, wincing apologetically. "Should I ask them to take it down?" Frank studies the headline, then looks at the Mustang. "No," he says finally. "Can't hide from the truth forever." The bell above the door chimes, and Eleanor enters, looking slightly harried but amused. "Well, our quiet restoration project just got considerably less quiet." "Welcome to small-town life," Frank responds. "You remember how it is." "Actually, I missed it." She moves to the workbench, spotting the ticket stubs. "You kept them too?" Frank nods. "Seemed important at the time, still does." Tommy busies himself with the Mustang's transmission, but his ears are clearly tuned to their conversation. The whole town is hungry for this story, for proof that some loves really do stand the test of time. "The reporters want to know if I'm staying," Eleanor says quietly. "Are you?" "That depends." She picks up one of the ticket stubs. "The Grand Hotel is nice, but it's not home." Before Frank can respond, Martha appears with their lunch delivery. She takes in the scene, the ticket stubs, the meaningful looks, the half-restored Mustang, and sets down her bags with authority. "Well, it's about time," she declares. "I've been holding that corner booth for you two for 40 years. The tension breaks, and even Frank has to laugh. It's so perfectly Martha, so perfectly Cedar Grove, to reduce 4 decades of separation to a reserved diner booth. "You know," Tommy ventures, emerging from behind the car, "my uncle's selling his house on Maple Street. The big Victorian with the wraparound porch." Eleanor raises an eyebrow. "The one with the 3-car garage?" "4, actually, and a workshop in back." Frank and Eleanor exchange glances, both recognizing Tommy's unsubtle matchmaking for what it is. But neither of them dismiss the idea. "Cedar Grove could use some investment in its historic properties," Eleanor muses. "Maple Street's a good neighborhood," Frank agrees. "Walking distance to the shop." They're interrupted by another reporter peering through the workshop windows. Frank moves to pull down the blinds, but Eleanor stops him. "Let them look," she says. "I'm tired of hiding." The afternoon sun streams through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beams. Outside, Cedar Grove continues its curious observation of the unfolding story. But inside the workshop, Frank and Eleanor share a moment of quiet understanding. Sometimes the hardest restoration work isn't on the cars at all. In the quiet hours before dawn, Frank sits at his father's old desk, a yellowed piece of paper spread before him. The hand-drawn business plan, sketched out one summer night in 1967, shows his younger self's dreams in careful detail. Floor plans for the ideal shop, equipment lists, projected costs, and in the margins, Eleanor's neat annotations about marketing and customer retention. He traces the faded ink with his finger, remembering how they'd stayed up all night planning their future. Eleanor had already shown her business acumen, pointing out inefficiencies in his father's bookkeeping system, suggesting improvements that seemed radical at the time but are now industry standard. The shop door opens softly. Eleanor, arriving, early as she has every day this week. She carries 2 cups of coffee from Martha's, the morning ritual they've fallen back into as naturally as breathing. "I remember that," she says, setting his coffee down. "You were so precise with the measurements, and you were so insistent about the customer waiting area." Frank gestures to the comfortable corner of the shop that matches her original sketch. "Almost exactly. Turned out you were right. Usually am." She smiles, but it fades as she studies the old document. "We had it all figured out, didn't we?" "Thought we did." Frank takes a sip of coffee. "Looking back, we were probably too young to realize how much we didn't know." Tommy arrives, right on time, his footsteps faltering when he sees them both at the desk. "Should I come back?" "No," Frank waves him in. "We've got work to do. The UE Mustang's not going to restore itself." They move to the car, where the engine block sits ready for rebuilding. Frank has ordered all the original specification parts, but with subtle, modern improvements that Eleanor approved. Better materials, more efficient designs that maintain the classic performance while adding reliability. "See here," Frank explains to Tommy, pointing to a particular modification. "This is something I designed back in '67. Eleanor used to help me test different configurations. The temperature gauge setup," Eleanor recalls. "We spent 3 weekends getting it perfect." Tommy looks between them, clearly trying to reconcile. The elegant businesswoman with the teenage gearhead in Frank's stories. "Is that why you went into tech, Ms. Mitchell?" Eleanor's hands run along the car's frame, remembering. "Partially. I learned about innovation here in this shop. How to take something that works and make it better. How to respect tradition while embracing progress. She always saw the bigger picture," Frank adds. "While I was focused on individual parts, Eleanor was thinking about systems, connections. They work together through the morning, falling into a rhythm that feels both old and new." Eleanor's business attire is replaced by neat coveralls, her expertise with engines surprising Tommy, but not Frank. She might run a technology empire now, but her hands remember the feel of tools, the logic of mechanical systems. "Your father would be proud," Eleanor says quietly during a break. "The way you've run this place, kept his values while building something new." Frank nods toward the business plan. "He liked your ideas, you know. After everything, he implemented most of them. Said there was no sense wasting good business. Sense just because the heart behind it was gone?" "Something like that." Tommy clears his throat. Mr. Reeves. "The parts supplier is on the phone. They found those original spec gaskets you wanted." As Frank steps away, Eleanor picks up the business plan, studying it with fresh eyes. The young woman who wrote these notes could never have imagined running a global technology company. The young man who drew these plans couldn't have known he'd build his dream differently than he imagined. "We both built what we planned," she says when Frank returns. "Just separately. Maybe that's what needed to happen." Frank picks up a wrench, its weight familiar in his hand. "We had to prove we could do it on our own before we could do it together. Is that what we're doing? Working together?" The question hangs in the air, heavy with possibility. Tommy suddenly becomes very interested in a far corner of the workshop, giving them privacy. "I'd like that," Frank says finally. "If you would." Eleanor's answer is to pick up her own wrench, moving to the engine with practiced confidence. "Then, let's see what we can build this time, with 40 years more experience between us." They work in comfortable silence, their hands remembering old rhythms while finding new ones. The business plan sits on the desk, a blueprint from the past that might just help build a future. The sleek corporate jet lands at Springfield Regional Airport precisely on schedule. Eleanor stands on the tarmac, watching as her children descend the steps. Michael, her eldest at 39, inherited her business acumen, but his grandmother's artistic soul. Sarah, 36, emerged from MIT with 3 degrees and her mother's drive to build something meaningful. "Mom," Sarah calls out, quickening her pace, "tell me you haven't been living at that auto shop for 2 weeks straight." "Hello to you too, darling." Eleanor embraces her daughter, then her son. "And no, I've been sleeping at the Grand Hotel like a proper CEO. Michael surveys the small airport. "So this is Cedar Grove?" "Well, the edge of it anyway." "Don't start," Eleanor warns, but she's smiling. "Your grandfather used to have that same tone about this place." The drive into town gives Eleanor time to study her children's reactions. They've heard pieces of the story over the years. Their mother's small-town romance, the mechanic who went to war, the choices that led to their comfortable upbringing. But now they're about to meet the man himself. At the shop, Frank is reviewing the family tree document Eleanor had brought him yesterday, a careful chronicle of her life after Cedar Grove. His coffee grows cold as he traces the branches. Her marriage to David Mitchell, a kind man who understood he was second choice but loved her anyway. His death 10 years ago, the children they raised, the company they built. The bell chimes, and Frank looks up to find himself facing younger versions of Eleanor's eyes in 2 very different faces. "Mr. Reeves," Sarah steps forward, analytical gaze taking in every detail of the shop. I've heard a lot about you, especially in the last 2 weeks. Sarah, Eleanor chides gently. Michael, this is Frank Reeves. Michael moves to the Mustang, his artist's eye appreciating the lines. The famous car. You know, Mom kept a model of this exact year and color on her desk. Used to drive Dad crazy, but he never asked her to remove it. Frank glances at Eleanor, who shrugs slightly. David understood some things don't need explaining. He was a good man, Frank says quietly. Your father. I read about his philanthropy work. He was, Eleanor agrees. He knew about you, about this place. Said everyone has a Cedar Grove in their past, a place that shapes them. Tommy emerges from the back office, and Sarah's attention immediately shifts. You must be the apprentice. I read your restoration proposal. The integration of modern diagnostic technology while maintaining period-correct aesthetics is brilliant. Thank you. Tommy looks overwhelmed by this whirlwind in business casual. Would you like to see the engine diagnostics? They move to the computer station, Sarah already asking detailed technical questions. Michael lingers by the car, studying the family tree document Frank had set aside. You know, he says conversationally, Mom used to take us to classic car shows. Said we needed to understand the artistry in engineering. I never realized she was looking for this car. Your mother always played the long game, Frank acknowledges. She did. Michael turns to face him fully. When Dad died, she threw herself into work, built the company bigger than ever. We thought that was her way of grieving. Now I wonder if she was preparing to come back here, to be ready when she found you. Michael runs a hand along the Mustang's frame. Dad used to say Mom was the most strategic person he'd ever met. Said she could see 10 moves ahead in any situation. Frank watches Eleanor with her daughter, the way she seamlessly bridges Sarah's technical questions with Tommy's practical experience. She's not the teenager who used to hand him tools and dream about their future, but somehow she's more herself than ever. Your father was a lucky man, Frank says finally. He knew that. Michael's smile is gentle. He also knew he was part of a larger story. Mom never hid your chapter from us, Mr. Reeves, or from him. The family tree rustles as Tommy and Sarah return, their conversation animated. Eleanor watches them with barely concealed amusement. Sarah, she interrupts, why don't you show Tommy your ideas about modernizing classic car diagnostics? I'm sure he'd find your research interesting. As the younger pair move away, Michael checks his phone. I should call the office. Mergers don't negotiate themselves. Alone again, Frank and Eleanor study the family tree between them. It tells a story of success, of family built and business earned, of love found and lost, and perhaps found again. They're good kids, Frank offers. They are. Eleanor's hand finds his briefly. They're part of who I am now, just like this shop is part of who you are. And the Mustang? The Mustang is who we were, and maybe who we might be again. Through the windows, Cedar Grove's afternoon. Light paints long shadows across the shop floor, turning the family tree's careful lines into something that looks almost like a road map leading home. The dashboard clock shows 9:47 when Frank turns the key. He'd restored it meticulously, knowing its significance. It had stopped the moment he'd driven away for basic training, Eleanor standing in his rearview mirror. Now it ticks forward. Again, marking new time. Ready? He asks Eleanor in the passenger seat. She's wearing jeans and a light sweater, looking more like her teenage self than the CEO who'd arrived in Cedar Grove 2 weeks ago. Ready, she confirms, her hand resting near the gear shift where it used to fall so naturally. The Mustang's engine turns over with a healthy rumble. They've finished enough of the restoration for a test drive. New gaskets, rebuilt transmission, fresh fluids throughout. Tommy stands in the doorway of the shop, giving them a thumbs up. Take it easy on the clutch, he calls out. It's still breaking in. Frank eases the car out of the garage and onto Cedar Grove's main street. The familiar vibration through the steering wheel brings memories flooding back. Summer nights, radio playing soft and low, the whole world ahead of them. The timing's perfect, Eleanor observes, professional ear catching the engine's rhythm. You always did have a gift for that. Had a good teacher. Frank shifts smoothly into second gear. Dad used to say you could diagnose more with your ears than most mechanics could with a whole shop of tools. They cruise past Martha's Diner, where the morning regulars wave from their usual spots. The town has grown used to seeing them together again, their story becoming part of Cedar Grove's living history. Remember that night we drove to Miller's Point? Eleanor asks as they turn onto the old highway. The night you showed me how to. Double clutch? You learned in 10 minutes what took me 2 weeks to figure out. The memory brings a smile to his face. Dad said he'd never seen anything like it. The rebuilt engine purrs as they accelerate, decades of wear and separation falling away with each mile marker. Frank takes the familiar turn onto River Road, where they used to practice high-speed gear changes away from prying eyes. The suspension's different, Eleanor notes. Smoother. Tommy's idea. Modern components inside, classic feel outside. Kind of like us. Same exterior, upgraded internals. Eleanor laughs, the sound carrying years of earned wisdom. Are you calling me upgraded, Frank Reeves? Well, you did trade a mechanics shop for a technology empire. And now I'm back in the mechanics shop. She glances at the dashboard clock, still steadily marking time. Full circle but different. They drive in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of paths taken and not taken. The autumn sun catches the restored chrome trim, throwing bright reflections across the hood. Up ahead, Miller's Point waiting just as it always had. Frank guides the Mustang onto the lookout point's gravel, the same spot where they once planned their future. The view of Cedar Grove hasn't changed much, a few new buildings on the outskirts, but the heart of town remains familiar. The clock, Eleanor says suddenly. You kept it at 9:47, the time you left. Seemed important at the time, Frank. Kills the engine, but leaves the key in, keeping that moment preserved. But you fixed it now, made it run again. Some things shouldn't stay frozen in time. He turns to face her. Sometimes they need to move forward. Eleanor's hand finds the gear shift again, her fingers tracing its familiar contours. I used to dream about this, finding the car, finding you. But dreams don't prepare you for reality. Reality's more complicated. Reality's better. She meets his eyes. Dreams can't age, can't grow, can't learn from mistakes. They're just stuck, like that clock was. From the town below, the church bells chime the hour. The dashboard clock ticks in perfect synchronization, marking present time instead of memories. Tommy's going to wonder where we are, Frank says, but makes no move to start the engine. Let him wonder. Eleanor rolls down her window, letting in the crisp autumn air. We're doing quality control, very important part of the restoration process. Frank chuckles. Is that what they call it in the corporate world? That's what they call it in any world where people understand that some things can't be rushed. She checks the dashboard clock again. Besides, we've got 40 years of test drives to make up for. The Mustang sits quietly, no longer a memory frozen in time, but a bridge between then and now. Frank reaches for the key, then pauses. Want to take her through the gears, see if you remember how to double clutch? Eleanor's smile is answer enough. The clock ticks forward, marking new moments in old familiar places. The modern business proposal sits between them on Frank's old wooden desk. Its glossy pages, a stark contrast to the worn surface. Eleanor has presented 1,000-page acquisitions with less nervousness than she feels showing Frank these few sheets of paper. A classic car technology center? Frank reads the title again. Here in Cedar Grove. The industry's changing. Eleanor explains. Modern diagnostics, 3D printed replacement parts, digital archives of restoration techniques. But there's a gap between the old-school craftsmen who understand these cars and the tech experts who could help preserve their knowledge. Tommy hovers in the doorway trying to contain his excitement. He's already seen the proposal, helped develop parts of it with Sarah during their long technical discussions. And you want to build it here? Frank's voice is carefully neutral. Where better? Eleanor gestures around the shop. You've got 40 years of expertise, a reputation for excellence, and, she smiles slightly, a CEO who understands both worlds. Frank flips through the proposal. The numbers are substantial, enough to expand the shop into the empty warehouse. Next door, create a training center. Establish a digital documentation system for classic car restoration techniques. This is more than just an investment, he observes. It's a legacy. Eleanor leans forward. Think about it, Frank. How many master craftsmen like you are left? How many young people like Tommy want to learn but can't find proper training? We could bridge that gap. Tommy can't contain himself any longer. Mr. Reeves, the diagnostic systems Ms. Mitchell's team has developed, they're incredible. We could document every restoration technique, create a digital library of your expertise. My expertise. Frank's voice holds a hint of amusement. Sounds fancy for a guy who learned by skinning his knuckles under old Fords. That's exactly the point. Eleanor's voice softens. We're not trying to replace traditional craftsmanship. We're trying to preserve it, enhance it, give the next generation the best of both worlds. Frank stands, moving to the window that overlooks the shop floor. The Mustang sits in its usual spot, half restored, representing both past and future. And what happens to the regular customers? The locals who've trusted me for decades. They remain priority. Eleanor joins him at the window. This isn't a corporate takeover, Frank, it's a partnership. You maintain complete control of day-to-day operations. We just provide the resources to build something bigger. We? His eyebrow raises. Mitchell Global Technologies. She pauses. And me, personally. Tommy clears his throat. I should check. On those brake lines. Once they're alone, Frank turns to face Eleanor. You don't need to do this. Us, the car. It doesn't have to become a business venture. No, it doesn't. Eleanor meets his gaze. But 40 years ago, we dreamed of building something together. We were just too young to know how to do it right. And now? Now we have the experience, the resources, and, most importantly, she touches his hand lightly, the wisdom to understand that business and personal don't have to be separate things. They just need proper balance. Frank looks back at the proposal. The plans are solid. He can see Tommy's influence in the training programs, Sarah's touch in the technology integration. It's a perfect blend of old and new, just like the Mustang they're restoring. Partnership, he says finally. Equal stakes? Of course. Eleanor's smile widens. I learned about fair partnerships in this very shop, remember? Frank picks up the proposal again, but this time his eyes catch on a detail in the architectural renderings. Is that your father's old sign? Yes. Some things shouldn't be modernized. The morning sun streams through the workshop windows, illuminating the proposal's pages. Outside, Tommy is explaining something to Martha, who's arrived with their usual coffee delivery. The scene captures everything Frank loves about his shop, the blend of community and craftsmanship, the passing of knowledge between generations. Okay, he says finally, but I have one condition. Eleanor waits, watching him with those eyes that still see straight through to his core. We keep the coffee from Martha's, no fancy espresso machines. Her laugh fills the office, rich with shared understanding. Deal, some traditions are sacred. The classic car show application form sits untouched on Frank's desk, its entry deadline looming. 53rd Annual Springfield Concours d'Elegance, reads the header, followed by categories that make Tommy's eyes gleam with anticipation. Best period correct restoration, he reads over Frank's shoulder. Best American muscle car, best story behind the car. Mr. Reeves, we could win all three. Eleanor picks up the form, studying the requirements. The show's in 6 weeks. Can we finish her in time? We can, Frank says slowly, but that's not what I'm worried about. They all understand his concern. Entering the show means putting their story on display, not just the car's restoration, but the personal history behind it. Cedar Grove's gossip is one thing. A major car show's publicity is another. The tech center announcement is going public next week anyway, Eleanor reminds him. This could be a perfect way to launch both projects. Tommy nods enthusiastically. Plus, think of the educational aspect. We could document the final restoration stages, show how traditional craftsmanship and modern techniques work together. Frank moves to the Mustang, running his hand along its newly painted fender. The candy apple red gleams under the shop lights, perfect as memory. What do you think, old girl? Ready to show off? Sarah arrives carrying laptop and blueprints, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. The diagnostic readings from yesterday's test drive are remarkable. The engine's performing better than original specs while maintaining period-correct characteristics. That's because your mother insisted on running the timing sequences exactly like we did in '67, Frank says. Some things you can't improve with computers, Eleanor smiles. And some things you can. The carbon emissions are half what they were, thanks to Sarah's modifications. The application form seems to draw everyone's attention. It represents more than just a car show entry. It's a public declaration, a statement about past and future merging into something new. We could enter under both your names, Tommy suggests. Original builder and owner, reunited after 40 years to restore their dream car. Now you sound like a marketing team, Frank grumbles, but without real annoyance. He's not wrong, Sarah interjects, looking up from her laptop. The human interest angle would be perfect for launching the tech center. Classic craftsmanship meets modern innovation. The story writes itself. Eleanor watches Frank carefully. She knows that look on his face. He's running through scenarios just like he used to do before making a major modification to an engine. The press will dig, he says finally. They'll want the whole story. Let them. Eleanor's voice is gentle but firm. We're not those kids anymore, Frank. We've built successful lives, raised good children, earned our place in the world. What's there to hide? Tommy picks up the application, pen poised. Should I start filling this out? Frank shares a long look with Eleanor. In her eyes, he sees the same mixture of excitement and nervousness he feels, the thrill of showing off their work combined with the vulnerability of exposing their hearts. One condition, he says, we do this our way. No corporate PR team, no scripted statements, just us, the car, and the truth. Agreed. Eleanor turns to Sarah. Think you can handle the media strategy with those parameters? Sarah's smile matches. Her mother's. Already on it. Tommy's been documenting the restoration process. We can create a narrative that focuses on the craftsmanship while acknowledging the personal elements naturally. The application form passes from hand to hand as they fill it out together. Tommy provides the technical specifications. Sarah adds details about the innovative techniques they've used. Eleanor handles the administrative sections. Frank watches them work. These people who've become an unexpected family around his beloved project. In the special notes section, Eleanor pauses, pen hovering. How do we explain what makes this car truly special? Frank takes the form, studies it for a moment, then writes in his clear mechanic's hand, first restored in 1967 by a young man in love, restored again in 2025 by the same man, with the same love, but with 40 years more wisdom. Tommy reads it over his shoulder and grins. That'll win best story for sure. It's not about winning, Frank corrects him, but he's smiling too. It's about showing what's possible when you take the time to restore things properly. Eleanor adds her signature next to his on the form, their names linked again after 40 years. Should I have the car transported to the show? No, Frank says firmly. We'll drive her there ourselves, just like we used to. The application form is complete, ready to be submitted. Sarah snaps a photo for the documentation, while Tommy starts listing the final tasks needed to prepare for the show. But Frank and Eleanor barely hear them, both lost in thoughts of another. Show another time, when they were young and everything seemed possible. Now, with the wisdom of age and the perspective of time, everything seems possible again. The press release draft glows on Sarah's laptop screen. Mitchell Global Technologies announces Classic Car Innovation Center in Cedar Grove. But it's the subheading that makes Frank pause. CEO Eleanor Mitchell returns to hometown, reunites, with first love to revolutionize classic car restoration. Too much? Sarah asks, watching his reaction. It's the truth, Eleanor says from where she's examining the Mustang's final polish. Though revolutionize might be overselling it. I prefer preserve, Frank adds. We're not changing restoration. We're protecting its future. Sarah's fingers fly over the keyboard, adjusting the wording. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and every detail needs to be perfect. Tommy has spent days ensuring the shop looks both authentic and professional, a balance as delicate as the one they're trying to strike with the announcement itself. Associated Press called again, Michael says, entering with fresh coffee for everyone. They want to know if it's true that Mom's investment in Cedar Grove was motivated by personal history. Eleanor straightens up, fixing her son with a look. What did you tell them? That the best business decisions often come from understanding what truly matters. He grins. Dad taught me that one. The mention of David Mitchell no longer brings tension to these conversations. His presence is honored in the story they're preparing to tell. The man who supported Eleanor's success while understanding her heart had never fully left Cedar Grove. Frank studies the press release again. You sure about including the personal angle? Could just focus on the business side. The personal angle is what makes it special, Tommy chimes in. Anyone can build a training center, but this... He gestures around the shop, at the Mustang, at Frank and Eleanor standing together. This is about something bigger. Sarah nods in agreement. The media will dig up the story anyway. Better to control the narrative ourselves. Control the narrative? Frank chuckles. In my day, we just called it telling the truth. Same thing, Sarah replies, just with better SEO optimization. The afternoon sun slants through the workshop windows, catching the Mustang's perfect finish. They've achieved something remarkable with the restoration, blending period-correct aesthetics with subtle modern improvements. The car itself has become a metaphor for their larger mission, honoring the past while building toward the future. Martha appears with a fresh pot of coffee and her signature knowing smile. Channel 5 is setting up cameras outside. Thought. You might want to know. Already, Eleanor checks her watch, the press conference isn't until tomorrow. Honey, in Cedar Grove, tomorrow's news is today's coffee conversation. Martha sets down the pot. And speaking of conversations, I might have had a few reporters ask about those burgers you two used to share in my daddy's diner. Frank and Eleanor exchange glances. The whole town has become part of their story, eager to share their memories. Of the young couple who dreamed big dreams over late-night coffee and early morning engine repairs. Maybe we should include some local color in the press release, Sarah muses. The community angle would resonate well. Cedar Grove isn't an angle, Frank says firmly. It's home, always has been. Eleanor moves to stand beside him, reading the press release over Sarah's shoulder. He's right. This isn't just about Mitchell Global Technologies expanding its reach. It's about coming home and building something that matters. Tommy, who's been unusually quiet, speaks up. You know what this reminds me of? That business plan. You showed me, Mr. Reeves. The one you and Miss Mitchell drew up back in '67. Different scale, but same heart. The observation strikes a chord. Frank reaches for the press release draft, making one final edit. Under the corporate announcement, he adds a simple line, some restorations take longer than others, but with proper care and patience, anything is possible. Sarah reads it, then looks at her mother. Eleanor nods, understanding perfectly. Perfect, Sarah says softly. That's our headline. Outside, the media crews continue to gather. Tomorrow, their story will belong to the world. But for now, in the familiar comfort of the workshop, Frank and Eleanor share a moment of quiet appreciation for how far they've come and how far they still plan to go. Martha tops off their coffee cups one last time. Well, she says with satisfaction, I'd say some things are worth waiting for. Through the windows, Cedar Grove's evening light paints everything in shades of possibility. Morning mist still clings to the Springfield Fairgrounds as Frank and Eleanor guide the Mustang into its designated spot. The car gleams under the rising sun, every curve and chrome detail testament to countless hours of careful restoration. Perfect placement, Tommy says, already setting up their display. The storyboard he and Sarah designed traces the car's journey, and by extension, Frank and Eleanor's, through carefully chosen photographs and technical specifications. Not too perfect, Frank mutters, making a minute adjustment to the car's angle. We don't want it to look like a museum piece. Cars are meant to be driven. Eleanor watches him fuss with the positioning, hiding her smile. Some things haven't changed in 40 years. Frank still believes every car deserves to be shown at its absolute best while remaining true to its purpose. The show trophy sits empty on its pedestal near the judge's tent, catching early light. Its Art Deco design echoes the classic cars surrounding it, but Frank barely glances at it. He's more interested in the growing crowd of restoration enthusiasts who are already gathering around their display. Is it true? One older gentleman asks, peering at the storyboard. This is the actual car you worked on together in '67? Before. Frank can answer. Eleanor steps forward. The very same, though it took some detective work to track her down, and 40 years of living to know how to restore her properly, Frank adds. The crowd grows as more people arrive, drawn by both the car's immaculate restoration and the story behind it. Sarah handles the technical questions about their innovative approaches, while Tommy demonstrates the blend of traditional and modern diagnostic techniques they've employed. See here, he explains to a group of young mechanics, we maintained all the original specifications, but we used modern materials for critical safety components. It's about preserving the spirit while ensuring reliability. Frank stands back, watching Tommy work the crowd. The boy's grown into his role naturally, bridging the gap between old-school craftsmanship and new technology just as they'd hoped. A judge approaches, clipboard in hand. Her experienced eye takes in every detail of the restoration. Walk me through your process, she requests. Frank and Eleanor exchange glances. Together, she asks. Together, he confirms. They guide the judge through their journey, finishing each other's sentences as they explain each decision, each carefully chosen modification. It's not just technical information. It's the story of two people finding their way back to a shared dream. The engine modifications are particularly interesting, the judge notes. These performance improvements shouldn't be possible while maintaining period-correct appearance. That's where the innovation comes in, Sarah interjects, pulling up diagnostic readings on her tablet. We developed new techniques that enhance performance without compromising authenticity. The judge makes detailed notes, but her eyes keep returning to Frank and Eleanor. You know, she says finally, I've been judging classic car shows for 20 years, never seen a restoration that felt quite so personal. More judges arrive throughout the morning, each focusing on different aspects of the car. Tommy handles the technical inspections with confidence, while Sarah presents their documentation with professional polish. But it's the moments between inspections that tell the real story. Eleanor leans against the car's fender, watching Frank explain a particularly clever restoration technique to a group of students. Remember teaching me about timing chains? She asks when they have a quiet moment. Remember learning faster than anyone I'd ever taught, he counters. Some things don't change. The trophy gleams in the midday sun, but its importance has faded. What matters is the crowd of young mechanics taking notes as Tommy demonstrates their diagnostic systems, the restoration experts studying their documentation methods, the future they're building out of their shared past. Ms. Mitchell, a young woman, approaches, notepad in hand. Could you explain why you chose this particular project to launch the new technology center? Eleanor looks at Frank, then back at the Mustang. Because some things can't be measured in market valuations or technical specifications. Sometimes the most important restorations aren't about the car at all. The reporter seems confused, but Frank understands perfectly. He reaches for Eleanor's hand, no longer concerned about who might be watching. The afternoon sun shifts, casting long shadows across the fairground. The trophy will be awarded soon, but Frank and Eleanor remain by their car, greeting each visitor with the same enthusiasm, sharing their story not for glory, but because some stories deserve to be told. Tommy joins them, excitement barely contained. They're about to announce the winners, but Frank and Eleanor are focused on a group of young mechanics examining the engine bay. Their faces bright with the same passion that once drew two teenagers together in a small-town garage. "We've already won," Eleanor says softly. Frank squeezes her hand. "We sure have." The new sign arrives on a crisp autumn morning, Reeves and Mitchell Classic Restorations, in elegant gold lettering with "Preserving craftsmanship for the future" beneath. Frank and Tommy stand in the early light, considering the best placement, while Eleanor supervises from the doorway of what used to be her father's bank, now transformed into their technology center's main office. "A little higher on the left," she calls out, suppressing a smile as both men immediately adjust the sign by practically identical amounts. Some things are genetic, even without a biological connection. "Perfect," Sarah declares, looking up from her tablet where she's finalizing the center's first training schedule. Young mechanics from across the country have applied for their apprenticeship program, drawn by the promise of learning from master craftsmen while gaining cutting-edge technical skills. The Mustang sits in its place of honor near the shop window, candy apple red paint gleaming in the morning sun. 3 trophies from the Springfield show rest on the dash: Best Restoration, Best American Muscle Car, and the coveted Best in Show. But it's the 4th award that means the most. A simple, plaque reading People's Choice for the car that best captures the heart of classic restoration. Martha crosses from the diner, carrying their usual coffee order plus extra cups for the construction crew working on the technology center. "Sign looks good," she approves. "Though I still say you should have kept the old one too." "We did," Frank points out, gesturing to where his father's original sign holds pride of place inside the shop. Some things you don't replace, you just build around them. The morning crowd begins to gather, locals mixing with new faces, all drawn by the promise of what's happening in Cedar Grove. Michael emerges from the office, architectural plans tucked under his arm. He's taken charge of the restoration, Zenter's aesthetic design, ensuring every modern addition complements the town's historic character. "First training class starts next week," he reminds everyone. "PR team wants to know if you're ready for the opening ceremony." Eleanor moves to stand beside Frank, their shoulders touching lightly. "No ceremony," she says firmly. "We'll start the way we always have, with coffee, honest work, and respect for the craft." Tommy adjusts the sign one final time, then steps back to admire their handiwork. At 23, he's about to become the youngest master instructor in their program, teaching a new generation how to bridge the gap between traditional restoration and modern innovation. "Remember when you first hired me, Mr. Reeves?" he asks. "Said you'd teach me everything you knew about cars if I was willing to learn properly." "Seems to have worked out all right," Frank responds gruffly, but his pride is evident. "More than all right," Sarah adds, showing Tommy something on her tablet. "Wait until you see the diagnostics lab we're installing next month. We'll be able to document restoration techniques that would have been lost otherwise." The morning sun climbs higher, catching the sign's gold lettering. Eleanor watches as Frank moves to the Mustang, his hand running along its fender in an unconscious gesture of appreciation. She joins him, their reflection visible in the perfectly polished surface. "Having second thoughts?" she asks quietly. "About us?" "Never." He turns to face her. "About all this?" He gestures at the expanding facility. "Sometimes I wonder if we're trying to hold on to something that's meant to change." "We're not holding on," Eleanor corrects him. "We're building something new out of something valued. Isn't that what restoration is all about? Before he can respond, a flatbed truck arrives carrying their latest project, a 1955 Thunderbird that needs complete restoration. The driver, checking his paperwork, seems confused. Got a delivery for Reeves Classic Auto, but this says Mitchell. Global Technologies? Right place, Frank and Eleanor say together, then share a smile at the synchronicity. Tommy's already moving to inspect the new arrival, tablet in hand, to document its condition. Sarah follows, discussing potential innovations they might test during the restoration. Martha appears with fresh coffee, and Michael starts sketching possible display ideas for when the car is finished. Standing in the doorway of their expanded shop, watching their assembled family tackle the new project with enthusiasm, Frank and Eleanor witness the perfect blend of past and future they've created. "So," Frank says, reaching for Eleanor's hand, "ready to start another restoration?" Eleanor's fingers intertwine with his, the gesture as natural as the morning sun rising over Cedar Grove. "Always," she replies, "though this time, let's not wait 40 years to finish it." The new sign catches the light, casting twin shadows that merge into one. Below it, the next generation of craftsmen and innovators begins another day of keeping history alive through the art of restoration. And at its heart, two people who found their way back to their shared dream stand, ready to guide the future while honoring the past that brought them here. Some restorations take time, some take courage, and some, like Frank and Eleanor's story, remind us that with enough patience and love, anything can be brought back to life, polished to a shine and made better than new.